In a quiet, gated community where every lawn was trimmed to perfection and every rule written in stone, one man's parked Jeep would ignite a storm that no one saw coming. The HOA president, a woman notorious for her obsession with control, decided that one locked vehicle didn't belong. What she didn't know was that the Jeep wasn't just another resident's ride. It was part of an active police task force, and her decision to break in would unravel her reputation, her power, and her entire HOA board. What happens when someone crosses a line they can't uncross? Officer Daniel Mercer had lived in the Oak Ridge Estates community for nearly 4 years. It was the kind of neighborhood designed to look perfect. Identical beige houses, white fences, and neatly manicured hedges that whispered conformity. It was safe, quiet, predictable, everything a police officer needed after long nights of chaos and unpredictability. Daniel was respected at work, but at home, he kept a low profile. His neighbors saw him as polite but reserved, a man who waved from his driveway, kept to his routine, and minded his own business. He rarely attended HOA meetings, not out of defiance, but because he believed peace came from distance. At the heart of Oak Ridge Estates was the HOA president, Karen Whitmore. In her mid-50s, Karen was the kind of person who believed rules existed not just to be followed, but to be enforced, personally and often dramatically. With her pastel sweaters, pearl earrings, and clipboard permanently tucked under her arm, she was both admired and feared. Some called her organized, others called her a tyrant. Karen had taken it upon herself to ensure Oak Ridge never declined. She measured lawns with a ruler, issued warnings for trash cans visible from the street, and even kept a digital log of residents' vehicles. Her belief was simple: control meant order, and order meant value. Daniel's Jeep was his pride, a sturdy black 4x4 with tinted windows, a government tag, and subtle modifications that most people would overlook. It wasn't flashy, but it stood out enough to bother someone like Karen. It was usually parked in Daniel's driveway, locked and covered when he wasn't using it. To Karen, however, it was an eyesore. She had warned him once before about non-compliant vehicle coverings, citing an obscure clause in the HOA guidelines. Daniel thanked her and kept the cover anyway. At first, Karen's irritation was silent. She'd make notes during her evening walks, tapping her pen against her clipboard as she passed his home. The Jeep sat there, clean but defiant, its black shape a reminder that not everyone bowed to her interpretation of the rules. But what truly tipped her over the edge came one Thursday afternoon when a group of delivery workers accidentally blocked the cul-de-sac while Daniel's Jeep was parked halfway across the curb. It was temporary. He had just returned from a late-night operation and hadn't yet repositioned it fully into his driveway. Karen seized the moment. Within hours, she was drafting an HOA violation notice. Unauthorized vehicle obstruction. Third warning. Except Daniel had never received the first or second. He returned home that evening to find the letter taped to his door. Neat handwriting, HOA letterhead, and a fine of $250 attached. He sighed, quietly frustrated but too tired to care. He had seen worse power plays in real life. This was petty suburban theater by comparison. The next morning, Karen called an emergency HOA board meeting. The agenda: unregistered vehicle and resident non-compliance. She presented photos of Daniel's Jeep, emphasized the potential safety risk, and convinced the board to authorize a towing order, a clear overreach of authority, but none of the other members wanted to challenge her. When Daniel left for work that weekend, he left the Jeep behind, parked in its usual spot, and secured with a reinforced steering lock, standard protocol for task force vehicles containing specialized tracking gear. It wasn't active equipment, but it was confidential. Karen, however, saw something else, an opportunity to make an example. She called a local towing contractor, someone she often used when enforcing parking violations. But when the driver arrived, he hesitated. The government tag and subtle decals made him nervous. Karen, impatient, waved it off. "It's just a resident pretending to be official. Cut the lock." The driver refused. She rolled her eyes, pulled out her own bolt cutters, and in broad daylight, under the gaze of curious neighbors, snapped the steering lock herself. What she didn't realize was that the Jeep was equipped with a motion-triggered recording device and GPS alert. Within minutes, Daniel's phone buzzed, a silent alert. Unauthorized access detected. He froze, and in that instant, everything changed for both of them. Part 2, rising action, 10:21 minutes. The notification pulsed on Daniel Mercer's phone as he sat at his desk, reviewing case reports from the night before. A blinking red dot on the tracking app marked his driveway at Oak Ridge Estates. Movement detected, lock breached, ignition tampered. At first, he thought it was an error. The neighborhood was supposed to be safe, the kind of place where crime meant a misplaced recycling bin. But when the second alert came through, unauthorized entry confirmed, he pushed back his chair, heart pounding, and stood. Years on the force had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but this was different. This wasn't a suspect. This was home. He called the local precinct, requested a unit to check the property for possible theft, and left immediately. Meanwhile, in Oak Ridge Estates, the scene was quietly chaotic. Karen Whitmore stood beside Daniel's Jeep, flushed with a mix of triumph and irritation. Her bolt cutters lay on the ground, the lock split neatly in two. Around her, a small cluster of neighbors had gathered, curious, uncomfortable, unwilling to intervene. HOA policy is clear, she said, her voice firm. No unregistered vehicles, no exceptions. One neighbor, a young mother from across the street, shifted nervously. Karen, are you sure this is okay? It's marked government property, Karen scoffed. It's probably just a vanity plate. People love to pretend they're important. She gestured toward the towing truck she'd called, a second driver this time after the first refused. Let's get it out of here. The driver hesitated. He was new to the area and had never seen a community quite so polished, or an HOA president quite so intense. Still, a job was a job. He began hooking up the Jeep as Karen supervised, hands on her hips, her satisfaction visible in every rigid movement. But before he could finish, the wail of a police siren cut through the suburban calm. Daniel's unmarked cruiser rolled into the cul-de-sac, lights flashing. The Jeep's alarm had sent a silent ping to local authorities, and protocol required a check-in. Neighbors scattered back toward their lawns as Daniel stepped out. Calm, deliberate, and unreadable. Karen froze, clipboard clutched tightly against her chest. Is there a problem here? Daniel asked, his tone neutral but firm. Karen recovered quickly, adjusting her posture. Yes, this vehicle violates HOA guidelines. It's being towed for non-compliance. Daniel's eyes moved from the cut lock on the ground to the bolt cutters beside her. He took a slow breath. You cut this. Karen lifted her chin. The association authorized it. Daniel nodded once, opened the driver's side door, and retrieved his ID badge. He didn't raise his voice or change his tone. He simply held it out, the emblem of the local task force catching the afternoon light. Ma'am, he said evenly, this Jeep is an active task force vehicle under state jurisdiction. You've just tampered with government property. The silence that followed was almost tangible. The towing driver backed away immediately, muttering an apology. The neighbors, who had been watching from behind hedges and mailboxes, exchanged wide-eyed glances. Karen's expression faltered, a crack in her perfect composure. I didn't know, she stammered. You should have told the HOA. How was I supposed to? Daniel cut her off gently. The HOA doesn't have authority over federal or state assets, and you didn't ask. He didn't threaten or posture. He didn't need to. The situation spoke for itself. When the responding patrol car arrived minutes later, Daniel explained what had happened, carefully, professionally. He requested a simple report for record purposes. Karen, meanwhile, tried to salvage her image, insisting it was a misunderstanding. The officer on scene listened patiently, then took her statement and left. The next day, the entire neighborhood was buzzing. Rumors spread like wildfire about the HOA president who broke into a police vehicle, about how she'd been investigated for property tampering. None of it was formally true yet, but perception had already turned against her. Karen, feeling cornered, doubled down. She sent an HOA-wide email blaming Daniel for misrepresenting his vehicle status and causing unnecessary public distress. It was a desperate attempt to reclaim control. But screenshots of the email circulated beyond Oak Ridge and eventually landed on the local community forum, where residents vented their frustration about years of her heavy-handed rule. One by one, old grievances resurfaced. Unfair fines, lawn measurements, the time she ordered a family's garden removed for being too whimsical. Her name became shorthand for everything wrong with Oak Ridge's HOA system. Daniel stayed quiet through it all. He continued his work, parked his Jeep exactly where it had always been, and let the situation unfold naturally. He had no interest in vengeance. The truth was doing the work for him, but the pressure on Karen was building. The HOA board, once her loyal chorus, began questioning her leadership. Some suggested a vote of no confidence. Others quietly distanced themselves. Then came the letter, official, sealed, and addressed to the HOA office. It wasn't from Daniel. It was from the county's legal division, citing a report of unauthorized entry and property interference with a government-marked vehicle. It requested Karen's appearance for a review, meeting, and documentation of HOA towing procedures. Her hands trembled as she read it. What began as an attempt to assert authority had spiraled into something far larger, her own credibility credibility, reputation, and influence unraveling before her eyes. For the first time, Karen avoided her morning walks. Her clipboard sat untouched. The neighborhood that once admired her precision now watched her with quiet judgment. Daniel didn't celebrate. He simply carried on, polite as ever. But the balance had shifted. The invisible grip she'd held over the community was gone, replaced by quiet whispers and lingering embarrassment. And though the paperwork would take weeks to conclude, the outcome was already clear. Karen's empire of rules was collapsing, one complaint at a time. Part 3, Climax, 30 minutes. For nearly 2 weeks, the Oak Ridge Estates community hummed with quiet speculation. The neighborhood's pristine calm had been cracked. Whispers spread across driveways and community chat threads like wildfire. No one wanted to speak too loudly, but everyone knew. The HOA president, who once fined people for a single weed, had crossed the line with a police officer's Jeep. Karen Whitmore stayed mostly indoors now. The pearl earrings and pastel cardigans had been traded for simple gray sweaters, her posture shrinking with each passing day. The same clipboard that had once defined her authority sat on a shelf by the front door, untouched. But the real breaking point came on the night of the HOA's emergency board meeting. The one called after the county's legal office demanded a formal response to Daniel Mercer's report. The conference room at the community center, usually lit by calm fluorescence and filled with coffee chatter, was tense and silent. Karen arrived early, clutching a folder of documents, the HOA bylaws, towing policies, and incident logs, her attempt to appear composed. The rest of the board filtered in, avoiding her gaze. For years, she had controlled the room. Now she could feel it slipping away like sand through her fingers. When Daniel entered, the air changed. He wasn't in uniform, just a plain shirt and jeans, the image of a neighbor rather than an officer, but the quiet authority in his presence was unmistakable. He greeted the others politely, then took a seat in the back row reserved for non-board residents. The meeting began stiffly. Karen opened with a statement, her voice a practiced blend of apology and self-justification. The events involving Mr. Mercer's vehicle were an unfortunate misunderstanding, she began, hands clasped. As president, I was enforcing regulations that apply to all residents equally. A murmur rippled through the room. One board member cleared his throat. But you authorized a private action on marked government property without confirmation. That's not enforcement, that's liability. Karen's composure faltered. I acted in good faith. Another voice interrupted, sharper this time. Good faith doesn't involve bolt cutters, Karen. For the first time in years, she had no answer. Daniel stood slowly. If I may, he said, his tone calm but deliberate. This isn't about punishment, it's about trust. Everyone in this room relies on the HOA to act within its limits. What happened wasn't just a breach of my property, it was a breach of that trust. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. A few residents nodded. Someone whispered, "Exactly." Karen lowered her gaze. The file in her lap seemed heavier now, the pages of bylaws that once gave her confidence turning meaningless in her hands. The county liaison, who'd been invited to observe, cleared his throat and read from a short statement. The investigation had found procedural overreach, negligence, and failure to respect personal property rights. No criminal charges, but a recommendation that the HOA conduct a leadership review and compensate Daniel for the damage caused. It was official. The board chair turned to Karen. Given the findings, and in the interest of restoring community confidence, we're recommending a leadership change effective immediately. A long silence. Then one by one, hands raised. Every board member voted yes. Karen's world, her years of control, her pride in order and perfection, folded in on itself in that moment. She nodded faintly, gathered her folder, and left the room without a word. Outside, the evening air was cool and still. Porch lights flickered on across the cul-de-sac as she walked home, the sound of her own footsteps echoing on the sidewalk she'd once patrolled like a sentry. Back in the meeting hall, Daniel stayed behind as neighbors approached to thank him, not for his badge, but for his restraint. He'd handled the ordeal without anger or spectacle. Justice had unfolded not through confrontation, but through calm persistence and transparency. He smiled faintly. Sometimes the quiet way works best. The following morning, the neighborhood felt different. The tension that had hung over Oak Ridge Estates began to lift. The chatter at mailboxes turned friendly again. And for the first time, residents started talking about revising the HOA's policies. Clearer communication, fair warnings, accountability for board actions. The Jeep sat quietly in Daniel's driveway, sunlight glinting off its hood. The faint outline of the replaced steering lock barely visible. It had become more than a vehicle now. It was a reminder of restraint, of integrity, and of what happens when authority forgets the boundaries it's meant to uphold. Across the street, a HOA election next week sign fluttered gently in the breeze. Karen's name was absent. The balance had shifted for good. The weeks that followed felt like a long exhale for Oak Ridge Estates. The tension that had once gripped the cul-de-sacs and trimmed hedges finally began to ease. Where there had been suspicion and whispered frustration, there was now a quiet curiosity about change. What the neighborhood could look like when power wasn't wielded like a weapon. Karen Whitmore's resignation became official 3 days after the vote. The HOA newsletter, once filled with her meticulous updates about lawn heights and paint tones, carried a brief statement. Effective immediately, Mrs. Whitmore has stepped down from her role as HOA president to focus on personal matters. No mention of the Jeep, no mention of the bolt cutters or the county investigation. Just a polite ending to a not-so-polite chapter. But everyone knew. You could see it in the sideways glances at community events, the way her name came up in half-sentences. You remember what happened with Karen, right? And the silence that followed. She withdrew from most gatherings, her porch lights staying dim long after sunset. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer quietly became the neighborhood's most respected resident, though he never sought it. He wasn't interested in power, only fairness. When asked to join the new HOA board, he politely declined, recommending instead a retired teacher named Mrs. Alvarez, who had spent years mediating conflicts between parents and the school district. Someone like her, Daniel said, keeps people honest. The board took his advice. And for the first time in a long time, Oak Ridge Estates had an HOA that listened. The first meeting under new leadership opened differently. No gavel striking the table, no lectures about rules or rules. Instead, it began with a simple question. What kind of neighborhood do we actually want to live in? Residents spoke up about overreach, about feeling small in their own homes, about the fear of being fined for the color of a door or the length of a guest's car stay. Daniel watched from the back of the room, hands folded, a faint smile on his face. Change was slow, but it was real. He returned home that evening and found a note tucked under his windshield wiper. Thank you for standing up. Not just for yourself, but for all of us. No name, just that single line written in careful cursive. For a moment, he thought about how simple the whole thing had started. A misplaced notice. A lock cut by someone who thought rules were above reason. The irony wasn't lost on him. A community designed for harmony had been divided by control, and it took one act of overreach to expose it. The Jeep sat quietly in the driveway, once again, just a vehicle. No longer evidence, no longer controversy. But every time Daniel looked at it, he was reminded that even the smallest abuses of power could unravel something much larger. Weeks later, the county sent him a formal letter confirming the case closure. The HOA had reimbursed him for the damages. The board was retrained, and a new oversight clause had been written into the bylaws. Any enforcement action involving resident property must receive written notice, verification, and consent from at least 2 board members. That sentence became the neighborhood's new compass. Born from one moment of arrogance, corrected through accountability. One afternoon, while walking his dog past Karen's house, Daniel noticed her outside trimming her roses. She looked up briefly, offering a cautious nod. For the first time since the incident, he nodded back. No words, just quiet acknowledgement, the kind that says it's over now. The sun dipped low, washing the streets in orange and gold. Lawns glistened with sprinkler mist. Kids' bikes lay scattered in driveways, and for a brief, perfect moment, Oak Ridge Estates looked like the kind of place it had always pretended to be. Peaceful, orderly, fair. As Daniel turned the corner, his phone buzzed. A message from a colleague at the task force. Heard your HOA made the news. You've got fans over here, he chuckled softly, shaking his head. Just doing neighborhood policing, he replied. But deep down, he knew this story wasn't really about him, or even about the HOA. It was about what happens when people mistake authority for righteousness, and how quickly that illusion crumbles when truth steps quietly into the light. Because sometimes justice doesn't roar. It doesn't kick down doors or make headlines. Sometimes it arrives in the calm voice of a man who refuses to be bullied, and in a community finally ready to listen. As the credits of this quiet suburban drama rolled behind the setting sun, the last image lingered, that black Jeep parked peacefully in its rightful spot, its new lock gleaming silver under the fading light, a simple symbol of boundaries restored and balance reclaimed.